Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event, British Academy Glencairn Conversations, held in partnership today with the Royal Irish Academy. Our topic is learning from COVID-19, how science can help build global resilience against future pandemics. My name is Daniel Carey, and I'm director of the Moore Institute at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and I'm the Royal Irish Academy Secretary for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'll be moderating the discussion. We're joined by a distinguished panel led by Professor Sir Adrian Hill of Oxford University, co-leader of the research team that produced the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. Adrian will give a keynote presentation, and we will then turn to a discussion with three leading figures: Professor Mark Ferguson, Director General of Science Foundation Ireland and the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government of Ireland; Professor Mary Horgan, President of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland; and Dr. Chris Lewis, Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I'll introduce them more fully when we come to that part of our proceedings. But first, I would like to welcome His Excellency, the UK Ambassador to Ireland, Mr. Paul Johnston, who will set this event in context and introduce our keynote speaker. Mr. Ambassador, over to you.
And thank you very much. And it's great to be with everyone today. And it's great to be doing this second Glencairn Conversation in as many weeks, this time in partnership with the Royal Irish Academy. We had one last week, which you can find on the British Embassy's YouTube channel, about an important moment in Anglo-Irish history, the 3-week period between the King's speech to the Belfast Parliament in the early summer of 1921 and the truce that ended the War of Independence in July of 1921. But today, as Dan said, we're looking at the present and at the future. And before you hear from your distinguished panel of scientific experts, I'm afraid you have to hear from an undistinguished political scientist in the form of me, the British ambassador. Glencairn House, which is the ambassador's residence, whose spare bedroom you see me in this afternoon, has been the home to British ambassadors to Ireland since the 1950s and has thus been the scene of some important conversations in our joint endeavours, sometimes in difficult times, sometimes in easier times. Sadly, because of COVID restrictions, we're not in a position to host you here in person today, but it's great to be having this virtual discussion, and I look forward to welcoming you as many as possible here over the rest of my posting here in Dublin, which happily stretches for several years ahead. As I said last week at the Aviva Stadium, we held a Glencairn Conversation on a period in the complex shared history of these islands. Today, we're looking at the present and indeed at the future. And we're asking the question, as Dan said, what can we learn from our initial response to COVID-19 and how science can help us prepare for the inevitable next public health crisis? And it's a timely event. Ambassadors always say events are a timely event, but this is a timely event because when the leaders of the G7 met in Cornwall last month under UK presidency, they committed to, and I'm quoting from the communique, to work expeditiously and collectively towards the goal of ending the COVID-19 pandemic, while also recognising that the next one could come at any time. They further agreed, and again I'm quoting, to strengthen our collective defences to better prevent, detect, respond to and recover from future pandemics through effective multilateral action and a strengthened global health system with the WHO at its centre. And they pledged, again quoting, to invest in innovation now with the aim of making safe and effective vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics available within 100 days of a public health emergency of international concern being declared. And this 100-day challenge was directly in response to proposals prepared for the G7 by the UK's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, the boss of one of our panellists today, and Melinda French-Gates, who needs, I'm sure, no further introduction. UK and Irish scientists have been critical to our respective initial national responses to this terrible pandemic, and indeed to the collective global effort to combat COVID-19 through groundbreaking research, clinical care, and offering their best advice to our governments. So I'm delighted to have eminent scientific figures here today to share their experiences and to kick off a discussion about what more our two countries can do together on a scientific level, both bilaterally and as part of the wider international effort, to ensure that we're as well prepared as we can be for the next crisis, whatever that may be. Our role here in the British Embassy in Ireland is to work in support of that greater collaboration between our country's scientists, public health experts, and indeed governments. And we look forward to taking forward the ideas that come out of this afternoon's discussion as part of our continuing work. Starting us off with his reflections this afternoon is Professor Adrian Hill, Director of the Oxford Jenner Institute, who was recently awarded an honorary knighthood by Her Majesty the Queen for services to science and public health for his and his team's work on the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, which I'm very proud to have 2 jabs of in my right arm, well, I hope now flowing through my whole body. His wider research includes developing vaccines for infectious diseases prevalent in developing countries, such as HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Adrian hails from the fair city of Dublin, is thus himself a personal exemplar of that UK-Ireland scientific connectivity and community that I was talking about. So Adrian, without further ado, many congratulations on your honour. Thank you for your fantastic and invaluable public service, and we're looking very much forward to hearing your keynote lecture today. So Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those kind remarks and for inviting me to kick off this discussion. As you've heard, I come from Dublin. I was at Trinity College for my preclinical medicine and then moved to Oxford, and I'm now based at the Jenner Institute in Oxford, where we develop a lot of new technologies for vaccines and new vaccine candidates. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Can I just check that you're seeing the screen?
Yes, indeed.
Good. So I'm going to be talking briefly about some observations on the experience we've had over the last 18 months making a vaccine against COVID-19 in a very short time frame, but more importantly, pointing out a few of the challenges that we identified, and identifying some things that maybe in future, when there are new pandemics, and there certainly will be, what we could perhaps do better, and particularly what Ireland and Britain might do together in terms of leveraging our particular strengths and collaborating to try and make a difference in this complex but exciting area. I'll be talking mainly about vaccines. That's not to diminish the importance of other interventions, drugs, use of new diagnostics, and so on, and particularly epidemiological monitoring. But I think where I can comment most helpfully is in what we can do together on vaccines. Just a reminder that this has been a horrendous pandemic over the last 18 months. 4 million deaths about today and still increasing. Happily, tens of vaccine candidates designed and taken into clinical trials against this SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. And remarkably, 10 of these licensed already and in varying degrees of use around the world. And this, of course, is absolutely unprecedented speed. So one of the lessons, of course, is how can people do this so quickly in a pandemic when if you're making a vaccine for, say, HIV, it might well take you many decades. Are there some lessons to be learned in speeding up the general process? Our focus was on a particular vaccine technology using an adenoviral vector from a simian source, a chimpanzee. This type of vaccine had only been used really in a small number of countries around the world. 3 in Europe, the UK, Ireland, and Italy, but had been in quite a lot of clinical trials, and 16 of these chimpanzee adenoviruses, as it says down here at the bottom, had been adopted not just by our university at Oxford, but major companies, including GSK, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca during the pandemic. And really, we were developing these because it is a very good technology for inducing cellular immunity, particularly of the CD8 T cell type, but very importantly for COVID, also neutralizing antibody responses. So this was a technology that was pretty new, Nothing had been licensed prior to the COVID vaccine, and that created an additional challenge. Now, one of the challenges was that experts in the field really disagreed on how long it might take to make a vaccine against COVID. And some of the greatest experts, Tony Fauci, thought we were looking at 12 to 18 months from last April, and that would be at the very earliest. Other really expert vaccinologists, specialists thought that that was too optimistic. So the honest truth is we didn't know. We were just committed to trying to do this as quickly as possible. So jumping forward 15, 18 months, we now have actually 10 vaccines. I'll show you a list of those in a moment against COVID. Our own vaccine made in Oxford and then partnered rapidly, not just with AstraZeneca, but with a key manufacturer, the Serum Institute of India. The progress is summarized here. High level efficacy over 80% with 2 doses at a 3-month interval. Data from not just the UK, Brazil, and South Africa, but more recently from the United States. 32,000 subjects vaccinated in the US trial with, again, very high efficacy against severe disease and pretty good efficacy, 76% against clinical disease, even with a short prime boost interval. And that, of course, led to regulatory approvals, again, in record time. By the end of the year, this was days after we had submitted the filings, several countries had already approved. Then critically, the European Medicines Agency, and particularly the WHO, approved in January. And in the last week, the latest data are approvals in 178 countries. And this vaccine is the major vaccine being supplied by the important COVAX international initiative. And notably, over half of those doses come from one manufacturing facility in one country, which is India. And I'll come back to manufacturing at the end, because I think it is something that really needs attention very soon. But there were lots of other vaccines. The most widely licensed technology is viral vectors now, with 4 different vaccines licensed in different countries. 2 RNA vaccines performed extremely well and are also widely used from BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna. But some Chinese vaccines are also increasingly being distributed globally, some of the most widely distributed, Sinovac and Sinopharm in China, and 1 Indian vaccine of this type. And then remarkably, again, I think the experts would not have predicted this, the classical way of making a vaccine expressing a protein, the spike protein in our case, and adjuvant, has not been licensed yet anywhere, but these will appear soon, particularly the Novavax vaccine. So for those of you keeping count, there are 10 licensed vaccines in at least 1 country, 4 from China. Interestingly, 4 from Europe, Russia, Germany, UK, and Netherlands, 1 from the US, and 1 from India. That's the country of origin where the vaccine was initially developed. So what have we learned? Well, lots of things. I'll just focus on a few. The positives first. What helped is having done many vaccine trials before. There weren't really centers starting up with a new technology from the middle of January and then trying to license a vaccine. You just can't do that. You have to be in play, if you like, to play and move quickly. Experienced clinical trial centers were crucial to get moving quickly and to avoid the delays that tend to dog the whole field. Regulatory support was critical for us. We went to countries where there were regulators that we had known before. The UK was very helpful here and very rapid in terms of reviewing our applications, but they did have a big advantage in London. They'd seen 9 of our vaccine types before, chimpanzee adenoviruses, so they had more experience of this. Safety data on the vaccine platform is, of course, important, but the RNA vaccines, which succeeded very quickly, didn't have very much safety data, but generally more and for longer is better. And of course, doing efficacy trials in many countries turned out to be important because happily during the summer of last year, there weren't that many cases. Recruiting in Brazil at that time and South Africa made a difference. So that was good, but the things we could do better on are listed here. We now know that you can produce a vaccine in a year. 3 companies did that. So can we do that faster for other vaccines? One of the big struggles we had was we were trying to make a vaccine for the world. That was the edict from our Vice Chancellor, no less, Louise Richardson, who of course is from Ireland. There are different requirements in different territories from different regulators. And even within Europe, there were lots of different views on how many people had to be vaccinated, how quickly, how much efficacy data we needed. It would be great if that could be standardized across international regulators, so you don't have to do multiple trials for different regulators. There are ethical questions that really haven't been discussed. So the Chinese and the Russians were criticized because they made vaccines, manufactured them, and didn't have efficacy data at the time they started using them. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think that's a big discussion to have. If, say, a microbe with the mortality of, let's say, Ebola, 60% of people who get infected die, and the transmissibility of COVID, hundreds of millions of people, if that came along next month, wouldn't you use a vaccine as soon as you knew it was pretty safe and immunogenic in humans and protected in animals? I think you probably would, but that's been a no-no historically. So people need a different response framework for pathogenic pathogens in pandemics. There was, of course, nationalism at many levels. For example, this quote, "Do a trial in my country or no approvals here," I made up to summarize what is the law in some countries. So is that right? If there are 195 countries, you can't do a trial in all of them to get registration there. Why should some countries be special? Pricing was very important to us. We knew that the world could not afford to pay for, say, 10 billion doses of vaccine if they were costing tens of dollars each. And that's why Oxford really took a lead on this and said, we're going to sell this vaccine at about $3 a dose. That's what it costs to make. And any industrial partner will have to do the same during the pandemic. And remarkably, we were able to pull that off with AstraZeneca. And then manufacturing is a huge issue still. That's what's delaying the global rollout of vaccine, not any operational issues. There just isn't enough vaccine fast enough. And what I'm going to try and persuade you is we were nowhere close to having enough vaccine to vaccinate the world, and we need to do something about that. Hasn't been bad. This is our own vaccine on the top left here, now distributed in 178 countries, 650 million doses by the end of May, one of them from one facility. It is the lowest cost vaccine by some distance, and it's the main vaccine being supplied by COVAX, even though other vaccines are appearing. But if you look at the two RNA vaccines, 106 countries and 56, there's the challenge of thermostability and needing freezers, and then lower numbers for other candidates. So to finish on manufacturing, what's the problem? Well, there are a lot of people in the world, nearly 8 billion alive. The largest number of doses of any vaccine ever distributed in a year for any disease until last year was 500 million doses. So if you've got 8 billion people, 2 doses each, you might want 10 billion, even if you leave out the under 18s. And that's massively more than the world was ever able to do before, at least tenfold more. You don't have the manufacturing facilities on the planet. And most of the vaccine technologies, I listed them, like RNA vaccines, viral vectors from simian sources, are absolutely new. And they've been made at small scale, mainly for trials. Nobody had had a go at making millions, let alone billions of doses. So that was a huge technological challenge. And typically manufacturing a new vaccine would need 3 years of preparation to get it pretty reliable. And of course, we knew that demand would be immediate after and even before licensure. Manufacturing takes months. And even when companies said they would produce a couple of billion doses in 2021, they didn't mean a quarter of those in the first quarter and an even distribution. Like almost anything you do, you get better and faster at doing it. And then there were all the issues of distribution of key ingredients for the vaccine that was not exactly free and widely available. So what we tried to do for this, and this was, a sort of in-house attempt starting off in April at the university, we transferred our process to UK locations, Italy, Netherlands, China, and India. And in India, that was crucial, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. And then AZ came along and increase that to 20 facilities in 15 countries. But that's still not enough, as most people are aware. This is the AstraZeneca plan, very praiseworthy in terms of the attempt, but still not enough vaccine for the world, even with 20 countries involved. And of course, then on top of the overall lack of vaccine, you have inequity in distribution. If you're in a rich country, you've probably been vaccinated. If you're in a poor country, you've probably not. And this is just a slide from 2 days ago showing that if you're in Africa, you're very unlikely to have had a dose of vaccine, very different in North America and Europe. And even more so, you're going to have a different vaccine in rich countries and in poor countries. In rich countries, these are mainly RNA vaccines. In poor countries, you'll be getting a Chinese vaccine or the AstraZeneca Covishield vaccine with the Serum Institute of India. What can we do about that? Well, it's a huge ask for 2 countries out of 195, but Ireland and the UK have particular strengths in many relevant areas. Just listing there, Ireland, particularly in immunology, pathogen genetics, translational activity. I won't read through all of them, EU membership, but particularly exceptional manufacturing capability at very large scale, unusually for Europe. Most of the big manufacturers of vaccines are in India, China, and Korea. The UK, of course, a lot of academic vaccine development, but not really large pharma activity on vaccines in the UK until last year. A very strong regulatory authority, a strong biotech sector, and like Ireland, many international links in the infectious disease arena. So this really is the punchline of my talk. I think there's a huge opportunity for Ireland to contribute to the manufacturing problem. I've told you the world needs more vaccine manufacturing capacity to deal with potential pandemics. And this is a problem because it's not cost effective unless people fund it through governments, through international agencies, and accept that there is a cost. You're going to have manufacturing facilities humming, staffed, doing something else, but prepared to down tools and start making whatever the pandemic vaccine is right away. And, we do this for other forms of defense. This is biodefense. We need manufacturing facilities. The UK has made a start there in a small facility in Harwell in Oxfordshire that will open next year, but it's nothing on the scale that you need for global supply. But in Ireland, Pfizer, famous for their RNA vaccine now, of course, for COVID, manufacturing already at Grange Castle, the only site in Europe with a technology for drug substance manufacture for RNA. WuXi we know fairly well. They were one of our chosen manufacturers in China, but are building a huge facility in Dundalk that will open next year. And WuXi now know how to make viral vectors. You've got RNA, viral vectors, and you've got APC, an Irish-owned manufacturing company that the Taoiseach made a very positive statement about just very recently. So I think given the wealth of experience in all biologicals and pharmaceuticals in Ireland, there is a real opportunity there to try and plug this dreadful gap in large-scale manufacturing, particularly in Europe, but also in the Americas, and do something about that. So I'll stop there and thank the team of 6 PIs involved in this program just at Oxford. If it was a Lions team, you'd have 3 English, 2 Irish, and 1 Scot on board. And of course, thousands of people in other countries involved in the development. I'll leave that there and pause for now.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Yeah, I guess you need a Welsh participant now to complete your Lions team, but that's very impressive.
We're working on it.
We got it. Good. And obviously, there's a lot of awareness of the Irish participation and a lot of naturally a great deal of pride being taken in that. I'm going to start now by introducing our panelists, and then we'll turn to our wider discussion. And I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. First of all, Professor Mark Ferguson. Mark, as I mentioned, is Director General of Science Foundation Ireland and the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government of Ireland. He began both these roles in 2012. He's also chair of the European Commission Pilot Advisory Board for the European Innovation Council. He's a member of the governing boards of the Global Research Council and of the European Commission Joint Research Centre, as well as being a founder member of the Small Advanced Economies Initiative. He has served in Ireland's response to the COVID-19 pandemic as a member of NEFIT, the National Public Health Emergency Team. Professor Mary Horgan has served as president of the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland since 2017, the first female president of the college in its 366-year history, and the first president to serve a second consecutive term since 1894. There's probably a story there. She's an infectious disease specialist and a member of NEFIT. Dr. Chris Lewis, our third panelist joining the group, is a Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. He is also leading the Department for International Development's Research and Evidence Division Science Cell, which includes experts in public health and epidemiology, infectious disease, also including humanitarian contexts and economics. His background includes working with NGOs on humanitarian health responses to the earthquake in Haiti, cholera in Zimbabwe, and a 4-year period in South Sudan working with NGOs and the Ministry of Health. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I wondered if I could start by getting some initial responses to Adrian's fascinating talk. And I wondered, Mary Horgan, if I could start with you. I mean, did you, at the beginning of this, share Dr. Fauci's estimation, if I can put it that way? I wouldn't call it skepticism. Perhaps it was just realism on his part, that it was going to take something like 18 months to get where we are. Or were you more optimistic and counting on people like Adrian to come through?
I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Fauci in March, and he highlighted that he felt he was being really, really optimistic to have a vaccine by 12 to 18 months. I remember being interviewed on the 11th or 12th of March 2020 on RTE, and said, well, we'll be lucky to get one. Clearly, I must have read something he said by 12 to 18 months. I actually never thought it would happen. And he said the same. I suppose he's been in the business longer than me, and having done or practiced infectious diseases for 30 years now, there was no way I would have ever thought that you could have gotten a new virus and a group of virus, coronavirus, for which we've never had a vaccine from, the 31st of December 2019, when it was first noted into somebody's arm by, and Adrian can correct me on this, but realistically the end of November, start of December 2020. Amazing feat of science.
And it's obviously something today we're partly thinking about whether we will need to repeat these heroics or even perhaps accelerate them, partly bearing in mind those mortality figures, which we may have got lucky on a certain understanding of the situation that we're in. Mark, if I could ask you a question, I wondered if you might pick up on the question about manufacturing, which was so important in Adrian's concluding remarks, but there may be other aspects of this talk that you want to address, but the manufacturing one does seem to stand out, and the potential in Ireland. I wondered if you would comment on that.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with Adrian. I think there's a lot of potential for manufacturing in Ireland. I'm very pleased that people are starting, and also NIBRD, which is the National Institute for Biological Manufacturing, essentially research scale-up facility, is putting in a new investment in vaccine development, cell therapy, and so on. So completely agree. I'd also like to say a couple of things. First of all, there was terrific cooperation between the UK and Ireland. I mean, I talk very regularly to Sir Patrick Vallance and others, and I'm really, really thankful for that, because in a small country like Ireland, there's a limit to what you can do. There's simply scale issues and so on. So it's been extraordinarily fruitful to work together with colleagues in the UK. I mean, things that I think we can also do better, as well as the manufacturing. In Ireland, I think we should look at North-South cooperation more. We have, for example, a proposal for a joint North-South research centre in infectious diseases. I think that would be a good thing to do. I think more generally, one of the challenges in a pandemic is how you catalyse leadership. You know, people often talk about following the science, but if you're following, you're always behind. And so the real question is, how can you catalyze leadership? How can you catalyze even a diversity of responses and then pivot to something that's important? And the last thing I would say, pick up on something Adrian said, and that is generally in the pandemic, systems that worked previously for whatever reason could very easily be repurposed in the pandemic. And I think there's a really important lesson there for future surveillance. I mean, a future surveillance mechanism is not going to have millions, if not billions of euros or pounds spent on it and then sit idle doing nothing for potentially 20 years. It's got to be something that's used. And, you know, maybe more widespread screening for either infectious diseases like flu or personalized medicine, and then pivoting that whole system towards a pandemic is a way to go. And the last thing I'll say, which I'm very fond of saying, is that when you don't know something, all uncertainty is double-sided. Things could be better than you think it would be, and things could be worse. And there's an equal probability of those two things, but most people always go to the worst side. And in the pandemic, you know, who would have thought that a vaccine technology or technologies that had never been in humans before would have worked as well as, if not better than, conventional vaccines? Who would have thought they would have been safer, and who would have thought we would have done them faster? And that's a real good example of how all uncertain things, uncertainty is double-sided. In this case, it all worked out better. And I think that's a really important lesson of hope for people going forward, that actually uncertainty is double-sided, and sometimes it works out better.
You raised an interesting question there, and I think it's partly the question of how the history of this pandemic will be written. Obviously, we're not in a position entirely to do it, but things are taking shape at the moment, and that certainly suggests that there were areas of success that didn't seem to be possible. Chris, I wondered if I could come to you and maybe get your response to Adrian's talk. There's certainly an important role for government in this, and that was referenced in his slides, but I wonder if perhaps you might address that aspect of the equation, or perhaps there are others that you want to pick up on.
Definitely, and thank you. And thank you to Adrian. Congratulations to Adrian and all of his team, and actually all of the people that have been working on vaccines. It's really an incredible effort. And I would agree that you've surpassed all of our expectations. And the role of government is clearly sort of the importance of government working alongside those in the academic and private sectors is key. And that collaboration, maintaining that communication throughout the crisis, public-private partnerships as well. So that is a key relationship. There is a role of government to work alongside, and also to keep in communication with those that are working on the vaccines in order to plan what next. When we were doing the planning for how to respond to the pandemic, Adrian and the other teams working on the vaccines, as I said, surpassed our expectations, which was great, but we were able to continue to communicate with the teams in order to put the pandemic plans in place. The couple of things I would like to pick up on, it is important to be planning for the next crisis, preparing for the next crisis, not the last crisis. And that brings the importance of the platforms that we've been talking about. I think as we look at the next crisis, it may be a pandemic, it may not, it may be another health crisis. Epidemics occur much more frequently. And actually, not all pandemics look like we've experienced. And that shows, as we look at these platforms that we are establishing, we need to make them able to adapt, able to flex according to the disease threat that is posed. But at the same time, we're not quite finished on this crisis yet. And I think as we think through the science, the technologies, the vaccines have made an incredible effort. We need to continue to look at therapeutics and diagnostics as well. And also the science of rolling out the vaccines is going to be another major challenge that's confronting us, both in terms of vaccine confidence, but particularly as we look globally and see some of those statistics that in Adrian's talk about the 3.8% coverage in Africa. What is the science and evidence of how we can use systems to maximize the coverage. How can we roll out vaccines at scale in some of these contexts without, as some of the G7 was looking at, mitigating the disruption to other essential health services as we do so. So those are some of the big questions that we need to face in this current crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you put your finger on some of the key issues there. I wonder if I could come back to you, Adrian, and ask you just a basic and perhaps even a naive question. I'm still a little bit unclear on how it was done quickly. I mean, there's an acknowledgement that it was done quickly and more rapidly than was expected, but is it a combination of things working in concert, or is there something particular you can point to?
Yeah, two main things. In real life, as I like to say, when we're developing vaccines for other diseases, it's very much a stop-go process. So if you have some encouraging preclinical data, you will apply, and it'll take you a year for money to maybe manufacture, which might cost you 1 or 2 million euros. And then once you've done that, you are milestoned and you go back to whoever's funding you, certainly in a university setting, and they'll look at giving you $1 million for a phase 1 trial. And then a phase 2 trial will be maybe 10 times that, and the phase 3 trial will be 10 times more. Nobody gives you the funding all in one go, so you can find out how fast you can actually go without being reviewed every time. Here, that just wasn't an option, so particularly the UK government, through the Vaccines Task Force, put a lot of money into this, essentially at risk. They were reviewing us continuously, but we overlapped manufacturing and all those regulatory applications. Phase 1, phase 2 were the same trial. Phase 2, phase 3 was another trial in multiple countries. So, in normal times, people wouldn't take the risk that the product would fail. And, it's easy in retrospect with 10 good vaccines out there to think, well, that wasn't much of a risk. But frankly, it was, particularly for the unknown technologies like RNA, which performed fantastically. That was really an act of faith by governments, or maybe an act of desperation by governments saying, we absolutely need a vaccine. Let's throw money at this and see what they can do. So I think we now have done an extraordinary experiment in product development to find out how quickly vaccines can be made of different technologies. If everybody downs tools on other activities, the regulators give this absolute priority. The government is there saying, what more can we do? That's not going to be the pattern with other vaccines in the next few years, but I think it will speed things up overall quite a bit.
That's very helpful, actually. That does provide some clarity about where gains could be made within processes that were up to a point familiar. Just one clarification, was there a massive expansion of your lab, or was that where the kind of manufacturing business partnership came into play, where they could create the kind of logistics in terms of the trial process?
Yeah, well, ironically, the pandemic helped because, we're an institute of about 350 people, and people had a choice, says he slightly cynically. COVID had to have priority. It needed a huge amount of space. It needed a huge number of people because the trials were getting very large. So, nobody had worked on COVID 2 years ago. So everyone had a choice. If you'd like to work on COVID, please do come in. We'll find you space and you can help. And nearly everybody did, which was extraordinary. So bad for other disease programs, but very good that we had immunologists, molecular biologists, preclinical people all available to move fast.
It's very helpful. Actually, just to get a sense of the scale alone, I think is extremely helpful. Yeah, Mary, I wonder if I could come back to you and to get a little bit more about your sense of perspective about how we can engage in certain forms of preparedness going forward. Is there kind of advice that you're working with on your colleagues and in terms of training, apart from anything else?
Absolutely. I suppose if I rewind to last February, March, we were kind of all at the same level of knowledge. In actual fact, I think we were ahead of the States because the wave went from east to west. And we really had to upskill our people on the ground very quickly with the information we had at the time. So we were able to flip very quickly to webinars and really use our Irish contacts, our diaspora. I will name check Susan Hopkins, who leads out in Public Health England with testing, who's been extremely helpful to Mark and myself when it came to rapid testing. So I feel going forward, we need to have a more formal engagement with people rather than the ad hoc, which we can do now because there's a crisis and everyone's more than willing to help and be generous with their time. But I think going forward, that's really important. The other area that the UK have been really, really good at was their clinical trials network. They were able to flip it very quickly, and they led out on the recovery trial, use of steroids, really the first treatment that me as a frontline physician was able to meaningfully use in patients. That's something we've just started copying here, and I like to copy and paste things. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. And the other thing, as well as vaccine development, is their whole genomic sequencing, their ability to sequence so many of what they anticipate would happen, which is variants, and viruses and variants are hand in hand. And what happens in the UK happens in Ireland 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. So that more formal engagement with our colleagues up in the north of Ireland, as well as the all the 4 nations, I think should be strengthened, because we're, as Mark said, we're a small country. We do need to be reaching out more. And as you see with Adrian, Susan Hopkins, many others, we've fantastic Irish people in leadership roles in the UK in infectious diseases.
Yeah, actually, I think that is an opportunity to come back to Mark and talk about that. You're mentioning infectious disease as a possible all-island center of discussion. And how would something like that work? Is there a foundation for it at the moment? Do you think there's a lot more things that need to be put in place for for that to really thrive?
Well, we're in advanced discussions. I mean, there are simple principles. Each can fund in their own country or legal jurisdiction, and it's simply a question of putting it together. And in a sense, it's no different from a distributed centre that Science Foundation Ireland runs anyway, where we harness excellence across all the higher education institutes in Ireland, and they extend that to Northern Ireland, and you extend it to mainland UK. So I think there's a lot of goodwill in that. To my great surprise, actually, Ireland has come up with the money first. I suspected that the UK would come up with the money first, but I'm pleased to say we actually came up with the money, and we're in advanced discussions about that, and actually about other things. You know, cybersecurity is another one, and food security. So it's not just on infectious diseases. So fostering that collaboration, and that's something we feel strongly about, and in training as well. I mean, we cooperate with predominantly the EPSRC and the BBSRC in centres for doctoral training. So PhD students who can get their training shared in Ireland and in the UK, co-supervisors, movement of people, all that kind of stuff. And I think there's scope for that too going forward. So I'd be a big fan. I think it's really important. It broadens people's horizons. And the last thing I'll say is that as part of the grouping of the global chief scientific advisors, the National Science Foundation in the United States, UKRI, which is the UK funder, and ourselves will launch a tripartite initiative, almost certainly along the lines of a tripartite centre for doctoral training. So PhD students could be co-supervised in any of the 3 jurisdictions. And particularly for small countries like Ireland, that's great, because you can expose people to larger facilities that we don't have, or infrastructure that we don't have. And equally, you can expose other people to things in Ireland. I mean, everything about being small is not all bad. It's just different. And there are shorter lines of communication, and there are ways that you can do things. So you get an experience of both of those. So I'm very positive about that. I hope we'll do both bilateral and trilateral things going forward.
That sounds very exciting and promising. I mean, do you have a kind of notional timeline for when you think that might be
Within the next year, So, I mean, budget's approved in Ireland for this. So we're in advanced discussions with the UK. And, you know, one of the great things about human beings is they forget very quickly, which is a good thing. Otherwise, you'd be depressed all the time. But one of the problems is, you know, people will forget about the pandemic after it passes. So we need to make it happen now. I'm determined to make it happen now.
Well, I think that is one of the lessons by analogy, in effect, with the speed with which Adrian and other colleagues have worked in the space. I think it is almost a reminder of perhaps our default settings need to be revisited, if I can put it that way. Chris, could I ask you a question coming back to this important question of global vaccination? And, you know, you have extensive experience in Africa, and I think, you know, Adrian might like to comment on this as well. But I mean, how is that actually going to work? So we have the manufacturing question on the one hand, but then we have also health systems and other logistical aspects of how it would work, and maybe financial questions and other things. But I wonder if you could give us a little bit more of an insight into, you know, the kind of the real work that needs to be done in this domain as you see it.
No, absolutely. And to start with, we're going to have the challenge of the supply issue. And that was one of the key things that came out of the G7, and one of the key things we're looking at globally. How do we rapidly ramp up the supply? But that will be the blocker. My guess is that will only be a blocker for the next sort of 6 to 12 months. Actually, we will, once we get the supply, we will then be reached with the next blockage, which will be, how do we roll this out? And this is being rolled out. We work in a number of these countries, and many countries have the systems and capability to roll vaccines out at scale, but there are countries that will struggle, that don't have either the financial resources or the operational resources to roll these out at scale. And I think my personal feeling is that we do need to focus on this before it happens. The rollout problem, we're already seeing some of the edges of it, but I think it will hit us with a vengeance once our supply issue is resolved. And I think we need to start thinking about the rollout issue and how do we strengthen the systems to enable rollout before over the coming months. We can do mass vaccination at scale. We have done it for other diseases. Critically, I think we need to make sure that we do the mass vaccination at scale without a detriment to other diseases. The other aspect of this is going to be, there's one aspect about the getting the mass vaccination at scale initially, sort of covering everyone that needs to be vaccinated. But the next challenge will be, how do we sustain it? And we don't yet know what will be required to sustain these level of coverages. But I think this is where even more challenges will come. And what we do not want to see is a dual world where we see half the world is vaccinated and able to drive down transmission, but the other half of the world is struggling with low vaccine coverage and waves of transmission, and actually sort of and that's the sort of the scenario that we want to avoid. We want to ensure that we get coverage as much as possible. Just to pick up on a couple of other speakers, just on the science to science collaboration, I think this has been enormously positive for what we've seen globally. And actually, the conversations, I've had a series of conversations with different ministries of health and science bodies globally, and these conversations are always mutually beneficial. This pandemic doesn't affect us all the same, and actually what we see is it, as we've seen with the spread of variants, it doesn't affect everyone at the same time. We can learn from each other, and we learn from each other through transparent sharing of data, but also through talking and communicating, because that means that when this specific variant then reaches us, we know about the evidence, we know how it feels from talking to others about how to manage the variant, and we're better prepared. So science to science collaboration, communication and collaboration is clearly important.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that theme for a moment, because I think it speaks partly to the fact that this is an all of society challenge, and therefore the humanities and social sciences, I think, are also a part of this. I think it's important today that we're reflecting on the role of science, and we are immensely indebted, as everyone knows. But also to really go forward, I think we need an integrated approach, and to try to model that to a certain extent, to look at best practice, and that would surely involve patterns of communication, but also questions of anthropology and sociology that relate to vaccine acceptance. Clearly, the vaccines can only be successful if they are, in fact, people are willing to have them administered. Adrian, if I could just ask you a question just about this question of the global dimension, and you referenced Louise Richardson's commitment to that as part of Oxford's development. Was that, how did that come about? Was that how did that conversation take place? Did you feel you were under pressure maybe to take a different view with that, or was it just a kind of a non-negotiable commitment, if I can put it that way, from the beginning?
We were aligned internally, so we knew we had to be, if we were going to approach big pharma companies and say we'd like you to do something you don't usually do, may never have done before, and certainly we approached companies that effectively were not going to consider that. And as you know, we approached AstraZeneca, who said yes very quickly. The question arises, would we do the same again for the next pandemic? I think for most of the world, yes. Interestingly, I think for some countries where financial people saw that this was an attempt to undercut the market and maybe damage the system in some poorly defined way, it was less, well, it was more of a problem than a benefit. And of course, many rich countries can afford $20 a dose for a vaccine, particularly for one that's ravaging the disease, ravaging the country. So, there are people now coming around to the view that this is fine for 190 countries, but maybe for, rich countries, you should just take the middling price. So there isn't negativity because you're seen to be providing a product that, just because it's cheap, might be seen less favorably.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to follow up a little bit with a question that's come in with you, if I might, about someone understandably asking, when can we come out of this pandemic if more transmissible variants keep appearing? I imagine you probably get this question all the time, even going to the supermarket or other daily activity.
Yeah. I've been getting it since, excuse me, last summer. Look, the honest answer is nobody knows, and it depends what you mean by coming out of it. This is very likely to be a virus that is not going away completely. That we may have to vaccinate against, certainly for vulnerable people, every winter or maybe every second winter. It may end up like flu, and you might have the flu vaccine at the same time as the COVID vaccine. On the variants, sure, they're a challenge, but we have been observing variants that are increasingly transmissible, but not really increasingly virulent. And it would make vaccinologists' life easier if the most transmissible variant just won out and stayed as the winner. Then you would have one strain to vaccinate against. That may happen. Unfortunately, it's the Delta variant, not the original variant. But we and other people are working on a there's no reason we can't make a Delta variant vaccine, and we're involved in that. So the honest answer is, I think we'll get a substantial degree of control by sometime in third quarter of this year. There will be another wave, hopefully not a big one, definitely, hopefully not one filling up hospitals later this year, but it may take a couple of years to really get this off the front pages of the newspaper, and it just becomes another endemic infection.
Yeah, very interesting to get your assessment of that. Mary Horgan, I wonder if I could ask you about a side of the equation that we haven't really talked about thus far, which is really the public health dimension. And do you see that as part of your brief, again, within the Royal College? And if so, how do we create that as part of the coordinated system and response? Obviously, the vaccines are crucial, but they're not the only dimension, and certainly not the only tool that we have.
Yeah, so the Faculty of Public Health Medicine is part of the Royal College of Physicians. It's a specialty that really had been under-resourced, not only in Ireland, but elsewhere. And I think that has come to light. We have fantastic frontline public health doctors who've done a huge job in controlling the infection throughout the country. And certainly, I suppose I'm based in Cork, and they've really got on top of things. We're the second largest city, and we've really, since February, have had very, very few cases within the hospital. The public health dimension is really, really important. And if we're truly going to live with COVID-19, which I fully agree with Adrian, we will have to for at least a while, we should be using all the tools that are available. And of course, the therapies, or what we typically treat as hospital doctors, patients in, they really haven't been developed. We're just using old drugs. But the main areas, that messaging that we all know well, masking, hand hygiene, and so on, but vaccination, but also testing, and not only PCR testing, but rapid testing. And again, the UK have led out on that. It's not one or the other, they're all additive. And I think it's embracing every single thing we have to be able to live with it, particularly our younger generation, who really have lost out a huge amount in this, and are, I suppose, most likely to get it, least likely to get sick. But as you said, that social impact that it has had on them is huge. And I would absolutely agree, this is a cross-sectoral issue. This is not a health issue. The impact it's had on our society, and indeed the mental health well-being of people is huge. And I think that you know, comes around to the messaging too. We need to be, I suppose, optimistic, like Adrian is. We will get out of this. It will be a low level. We are getting there, albeit slowly, but in the right direction. That's really, and I see it when people start, you know, saying about the Delta variant. My patients get frightened again. Oh my God, am I at risk? They're all fully vaccinated. So I think, you know, the communication emergency that a pandemic is key. But yes, our public health doctors absolutely need a huge investment in the infrastructure. So it's a population level, and me not just treating an individual. That's what counts.
Yeah. Could I ask you, I think it follows on naturally to ask you a little bit about the kind of One Health paradigm. And is that something that you're invested in, if I can put it that way? Is that the kind of perspective that we need at this time?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think we've gone down to a very, very individualistic approach to health. And I don't think that's necessarily the right thing. It might be good for one person, but it's much more, should be more holistic, not just for the person, but also for communities in which we live, and that public health intelligence that public health doctors know about their local community, onto the global approach to how we deal with diseases, in this instance, infectious disease. I think we need to be much broader in our approach, and get away from too much specialization. I don't think it's particularly a great way forward in dealing with it. So that global health, that One Health is really, really important.
It seems pretty clear that some of our habits, our working habits and our intellectual habits, are probably going to have to change, and the pressure of circumstance will hopefully have proved instructive, even if it's taking place in a kind of crisis context.
And I think just that, you know, we have gone back to simpler lives. That's not all bad. A lot of that is really good. I think we've got more time to do things that we like, despite the huge impact this has had on our society.
That is one of the great questions going forward. Exactly, precisely that. Mark, if I could come back to you and ask you about, I mean, there were some interesting points on Adrian's slides there about what Ireland and the UK can do together. Do you have a similar sort of, you know, kind of mental set of bullet points that you're pushing for, perhaps in your chief scientific advisor role? What do you think we should be concentrating on?
Yeah, so there are a whole series of things where obviously you can do things better. So definitely on the UK collaboration, I think on the scientific front, on the clinical trials front, definitely. I mean, it was very, very interesting. Again, the analogy that where you had pre-existing networks, they worked very well. So the UK Clinical Trials Network went very well. By contrast, the WHO trials, which were conceived with very good intention, I mean, it took forever for people to get signed up in terms of the bureaucracy. I mean, I don't know, I was going nuts in Ireland because, you know, it was months to get us signed up into the clinical trial. And that tells you need to have these things set up and working, and people working together, and a degree of understanding and trust and so on within the system. So those are very important aspects. So definitely, I think we can do much more in terms of collaboration at the basic science level, at the clinical level, coordinating at the policy level. And then interestingly, you know, there's been global and European meetings on a weekly basis of chief scientific advisors, and that's been terrific. I mean, a lot of knowledge sharing and so on. But we've been thinking about things that we could do better. And, you know, what were underappreciated things in the COVID-19 crisis? Well, I think we all underappreciated, to pick up on your point about the humanities, the importance of fear in terms of people's judgment on how they behave. That's probably something we could have learned from. You could look and see, did anybody actually predict that we would have a major problem in nursing homes? And there were very few countries that did that. Yet it was important and it was obvious. So, you know, if you're going to be self-critical, you need to think, how can you miss important, obvious things? It's often difficult to, it's often easy to understand how you can miss important things that weren't so obvious. So I think that's kind of key. And getting some of those things more firmly embedded. But I'm a great believer in also wanting to catalyze what I talked about before, which is leadership, you know, scientific leadership. The UK were terrific on that. I mean, they took leadership in the vaccines, they took leadership in rapid testing, they took leadership in a number of these areas. And that's really important. And in today's climate, they took leadership by taking a venture capital approach to investing, where you essentially place a number of investments at scale so that people can succeed. And, you know, the European disease is to underfund things. And I'm very fond of saying that as a funder. And why? Because people are subject to pressure, you know, to account for something. Well, you can say you're going to make a number of investments, and actually if one or two of them work out well and the others don't, but collectively you learn something, then that's okay. That's an okay way forward. So we need to get used to that idea that failure doesn't mean that somebody misused your funding. Failure means that actually you learned something. Not everything you do works out the way that you expect. In fact, very few things work out the way you expect. Some things work out much better and some things don't work out so well, but you learn something from that. So I think, you know, that's those philosophies become really quite important going forward. So there's lots to do, lots to learn, but actually we did a lot of things well. You know, people often get very negative, and it's important to be constructive and look back and see how we can improve. But we also did quite a lot of things well, and we should look at that as well and think about how can we further improve those.
Could I just ask you about some of the kind of impediments to exchange of data that might be in place, for example, in relation to human genome with the UK, in relation to GDPR? Do you have views on that, and how we can create a kind of coordinated system which will facilitate that in the future?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the stuff that people talk about actually is a non-problem. What you really need to do is just get the stuff set up. I mean, GDPR, the European Union has recognized the UK systems. There is formally no impediment to exchange of data. What there is a requirement to make the systems work. And, you know, all systems are full of people who are by nature conservative, or who don't want to take a risk, or who want to, you know, be very slow and careful and so on. And those are often good qualities, but you sometimes need to speed them up. But formally, there is no reason why we can't do that. You have, of course, the importance of patient confidentiality. And there is a discussion to be had with the public about how much privacy people want. So to give you an example, if you are the only person in the world who knows your genomic sequence, it is of absolutely no value to you, because the only value it has to you is when you're able to compare it with other people's sequences and be able to make predictions about your susceptibility or resistance to various diseases and so on. So there is a discussion to be had around the whole idea of privacy, and people share the most intimate of data often without a thought on social media platforms, yet they're very concerned, you know, if somebody outside a medical circle tells somebody they had the flu last year or something like that. So there's a discussion to be had. And I think in Ireland, with our history of citizens' assemblies, that's a very good place to have a discussion about, you know, what's a collective public interest? What's an interest to me where I have to do some sharing? What could genuinely be private? You know, that whole area, I think, is ripe for a decent societal discussion. And if we get that right, actually, we can get a lot of things right going forward. And equally, if we get it wrong, it could be an impediment.
I mean, that's a very interesting suggestion about a citizens' assembly. I think that's one we might have to take forward. Chris, I want to ask you a question about, and it was referenced there, I think by Mark, about the WHO and its role. I mean, obviously there were moments when it was a little bit precarious in the previous US administration. And what importance do you attach to the WHO in its role in all of this?
WHO plays a key role centrally in bringing a lot of this together. Now, clearly, they're not implementing. They are there playing a critical role. For example, we were in discussions with WHO a few years ago. I was sitting around a table with the WHO blueprint plans, which was the blueprint for R&D for epidemics and pandemics. And we were talking about a disease X, which would be hitting us in the coming years, and what we can do collaboratively, globally, to be preparing for this disease X in terms of vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, and other research. And WHO does play a critical role to bring us together in terms of the science, the R&D helping us, and also in terms of this rollout. I think one of the things which I'm looking forward to seeing is the WHO global vaccine rollout strategy, in how we are really going to address this question of your last question. So there is and clearly there are things that we have all done well. There are things that we can all improve following this pandemic, and WHO is not immune to either of those. They've done things well, and there are things that they can improve. Just actually linked to that, I think my thesis was actually on opportunities arising from health crises, and I think Mark alluded to this in the response to the last question. And if we look at the evidence of how do we take the opportunities, take the window of opportunities that arise from this pandemic, if we look at what's happened before, actually it's important that we're strategic, that opportunities don't just happen. We need to make them happen. And that's, if we look at the way that we have taken opportunities from other crises, it's because people have sort of very strategically identified an opportunity. A small group of people have worked on that and implemented it during the crisis or very soon after the crisis. If you look at the creation of the National Health Service, I think in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, it was followed this trend. So we do need to think globally and in each country. What are the opportunities that are arising for this crisis, for whatever aspect that is, whether it's WHO, whether it's our work on epidemics and pandemics or other issues. And just to it, I think there is a question in the chat happy to address in terms of the long COVID.
Yes, someone asked that, yeah.
I think it's an area that we don't know enough about. I think it is an area we see significant number of people experiencing persistent symptoms. I think we've got about 38% of symptomatic people that experience at least one symptom lasting more than 12 weeks, and sort of about 15% of people with 3 or more symptoms. So it is something which we need to take very seriously. I am concerned about it. I think there's an awful lot that we don't know about it. But I think with all of these things, as we think through it, we will be able to address it. I have no doubt that I completely agree with the importance of taking a public health approach to these things. I wonder what, yes, it'd be interesting, not to knock a question onto another panelist, but I'd be fascinating to know from Adrian what he thinks about vaccines and long COVID. It's something I was actually thinking about earlier today. But anyway, that's, I guess, I'll stop bumping questions to other panelists.
No, well, that's okay. I think we should ask him. It's on the table there, Adrian, if you have views on whether there's a vaccine.
Briefly, we need more data, the usual academic cop-out answer, but we will get those data, I think. Look, it's very likely that the vaccines will work pretty well against long COVID, because we understand what the vaccines are doing now. Even if they don't protect you completely against getting the virus in your throat and maybe a mild upper respiratory tract infection, there's good evidence that long COVID is seen more frequently in people with more severe disease. So we should be seeing a preventive effect, not complete, but partial, of vaccines against long COVID. The one thing I'd like to throw in here is we should remember that 10 years ago, we wouldn't have had anything like the data we have on how any intervention, a vaccine, a diagnostic, a drug works in COVID without the record linkage systems that we have in many countries now. So, you know, it was a little galling for us having done 60,000 people in a year in trials, and then in a month, Scotland just produced data on 4.5 million people and how the vaccine was working. It was great, but it was massively more cost effective to just do record linkage. That's why the rare side effects have come up so quickly, unlike previous vaccines. Long COVID, we should be able to pull out as well very soon. Mm-hmm. So I think the vaccines will work, but we need more data.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I guess that is certainly is the future of it. And there's aspects of the infrastructure that I guess we all take to a certain extent for granted that really are revolutionary. So that's part of the story, I think, and not merely the acceleration with which the vaccine development has taken place. We've come really towards the end of our time, and I'm going to hand over in a moment to the president of the Royal Irish Academy, but I wanted to thank you all very much for extremely stimulating discussion and for being available today to take us through these key questions that are preoccupying all of us, not just in Ireland and in the UK, but in a global setting more generally. So I wonder if I could hand over now to Dr. Mary Canning, who is president of the Royal Irish Academy. Mary, you're going to make some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for entrusting me to close this important and informed discussion this afternoon. Lots of issues have been raised and the challenges that remain have been discussed. Before I say anything, I want to thank, first of all, the contributors to this afternoon, to the scientists who have done so much for us and have shown that how not only will we be able to emerge from this crisis, but that you're all thinking about the future and the challenges of the future. So thank you for everything. It's humbling and it's inspiring for those of us who are not scientists. Secondly, I'd like to thank the ambassador. The work we would do together, that we do together, between the Academy and the UK through the academies in the UK and our own experience of working north-south and east-west through the Celtic Alliance is particularly relevant at the moment, and we would like very much to continue this cooperation. In this context, I would comment also on the Taoiseach's announcement today of the Shared Island Initiative, in which 40 million euros from his department will go to shared research, north and south. And again, I think based on what I've heard this afternoon about the strengths that we have in Ireland, north and south, and our own linkages, east and west, this is tremendously important and encouraging. We heard lots of issues this afternoon. Mark talked about the role of the humanities and social sciences, and various other people did too. Surely the issues there are around ethics, the ethics of who gets the vaccine, around the inequalities of access, around culture, including those people who seem to have problems accepting the vaccine, and the whole business of fear. Again, Mark mentioned that, and the need for communication and trust. And here again, I think our own experience in the Academy on the relevance of the social sciences disciplines, and I think Louise Richardson would agree with me on this, actually. This again is something we could perhaps explore further. The government requirement for access to experts and expertise during the crisis has shown the importance of ensuring that up-to-date research and researchers continuously feed into the policy-making process. And to that end, the Academy has been working with the Irish Research Council on a roadmap that could improve the linkages. And in that way, we might also be better prepared for the next crisis. And I would finish again by saying that the Academy itself has done quite a lot of work. Dan has curated a series of webinars on various aspects of what has been happening post-COVID. And we've also set up a higher education futures group, looking again at strengthening aspects of higher education and focusing on the policy areas which are very important as we continue to face the challenges. So, Ambassador and guests, I look forward to meeting you all at some point, to welcoming you to Academy House. We hope we're nearly at the end of this. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined in this afternoon, and hope perhaps we will continue. Thank you again, and goodbye, and thanks.